Douglas had exactly 10 seconds to decide. 10 seconds to choose between following the rules or following his gut. 10 seconds that would determine if a multi-million-dollar empire fell, or if he'd even be alive to see the morning. His name was Douglas. To most people in this building, he was just a shadow in dark blue overalls, a man whose presence was only noted by the smell of floor wax and the rhythmic jingle of keys. He wasn't looking for a promotion. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He was just a man trying to finish his shift and get home to a quiet apartment. But sometimes, life doesn't care about your schedule. Sometimes it puts you in one impossible moment where being invisible is no longer an option. And Douglas? He made a choice that stopped a professional robbery and changed the life of a man who had never even looked him in the eye. This is his story. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at a locked door the same way again. Because what started with a simple turn of a key ended with a world being rebuilt. Stay with me. You need to hear this. Welcome to Blood and Roses Chronicles. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you about Douglas. He was just like so many of us, working hard, doing his job, and moving through the world with a quiet dignity that most people missed. He was 58 years old, and if you passed him in the lobby, you probably wouldn't notice him. That was exactly how he wanted it. In his world, being invisible meant peace. He worked at the Global Heights Tower, one of those glass and steel monoliths, where the carpet is thicker than a paycheck and the air smells like expensive cologne. But Douglas wasn't thinking about the prestige. He was thinking about his knees. They ached with every step on the marble floors. He had 2 hours left on his shift, and his only goal was to lock the finance wing and punch out. But tonight, the air in the building felt different, heavy, like the silence right before a storm breaks. Douglas moved with a slow, rhythmic grace that comes only from decades of repeating the same motions. To the high-flying tenants of the Global Heights Tower, the building was a monument to ambition, a vertical city of glass and high-stakes deals. But to Douglas, the tower was a living, breathing organism, and he was the only one who truly understood its heartbeat. While the executives on the top floors focused on the horizon, Douglas focused on the corners. He knew which elevator cable groaned when the wind exceeded 30 knots, which floor tiles in the lobby were loose enough to click like a telegraph under a heavy heel, and exactly which ventilation shafts carried the faint scent of expensive tobacco from the private lounges down to the basement. Every night at 6 p.m., his ritual began. He didn't just clean. He conducted a nightly audit of a world that ignored him. He pushed his cart, a rattling chariot of spray bottles and microfiber cloths, through the vast corridors of the finance wing, his ID badge swinging like a pendulum against his chest. To David and the other suits, Douglas was a background detail, as stationary as the potted palms or the abstract art on the walls. They spoke about multi-million-dollar mergers and private scandals while he was inches away, buffing the mahogany conference tables, assuming his presence was as inconsequential as a shadow. They never realized that Douglas knew who was truly failing, who was sleeping in their office because their marriage was crumbling, and who was skimming from the petty cash, all by the state of their trash cans and the tension in their discarded notes. He took a quiet pride in this guardian's perspective. He was the keeper of the building's integrity. As he worked his way toward the higher floors, he noticed things the sophisticated security cameras often missed. He saw the way the door to the loading dock didn't quite latch if the humidity was too high. He noticed when a light flicker wasn't just a dying bulb, but a sign of a faulty circuit in the server room. He was the silent witness to the building's vulnerabilities, the man who held the master keys to every locked secret in the tower. On this particular night, the air felt charged, a subtle vibration in the soles of his shoes that didn't match the building's usual hum. The important people were already gone or buried in their monitors, but Douglas, the man who saw everything because no one saw him, knew the night was just beginning. His knee gave a sharp, familiar twinge as he turned his cart toward the north corridor, a silent warning that the balance of the building was about to shift. The shift in the building's energy wasn't something you could see on a monitor. It was a cold draft that shouldn't have been there and a silence that felt too heavy. Douglas stopped his cart near the service elevator, his ears straining. The Global Heights tower usually hummed with the white noise of cooling fans and the distant pulse of the city, but tonight, the rhythm was off. He walked toward the narrow window of the supply closet that overlooked the loading dock, pulling back the industrial blind just enough to peer out into the rainy Chicago night. There, idling at the edge of the yellow security lights, sat a white service van. It had no markings, no company logo, and its headlights were extinguished, making it look like a predator crouching in the weeds. Douglas frowned, his mind instantly scanning the night's scheduled maintenance. There were no deliveries expected, and the HVAC team wasn't due until Tuesday. He watched as the back doors of the van creaked open, just a sliver. Two figures stepped out, moving with a synchronized, military precision that had nothing to do with plumbing or electrical work. They weren't carrying toolboxes, they were carrying heavy, rectangular bags, and their faces were obscured by the deep hoods of dark rain gear. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning raced down Douglas's spine. He watched them bypass the main sensor and slip toward the side entrance, a door that Douglas knew had a temperamental latch in this kind of wet weather. They didn't fumble. They didn't hesitate. They moved like people who had studied the blueprints Douglas had spent 40 years memorizing. In that moment, the invisible man felt a surge of adrenaline that made his aching knees feel weightless. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a sentry. He stepped back from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew the protocol was to call Central Security, but he also knew the men behind the desks on the first floor. They'd be half asleep, distracted by their phones, and they certainly wouldn't take the word of a man who emptied their trash. By the time they finished their coffee and checked the cameras, those shadows would be in the elevators. Douglas looked at the heavy ring of keys at his hip. He knew exactly where they were heading. The finance wing on the fourth floor held the physical backup servers and the high-security safes, the soft underbelly of the empire. He had to move. He had to get there before the shadows did, not because he was told to, but because this building was his charge, and he was the only one who knew the back stairs well enough to beat them to the door. The fourth-floor corridor felt like a tunnel of polished stone and judgment as Douglas emerged from the service stairwell, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He didn't look at the clock, but his internal rhythm told him it was barely 8:50 p.m. In 10 minutes, the automatic security timers would kick in, but 10 minutes was an eternity for men who moved like ghosts. He hurried toward the massive, reinforced glass doors of the finance wing, his boots squeaking on the fresh wax. The gold leaf lettering of the department name shimmered under the recessed lighting, a symbol of a world he was never meant to enter, only to maintain. With trembling hands, he reached for the master key, the heavy brass one that felt like a scepter in his calloused palm. He was halfway through the turn, the heavy deadbolt sliding into the frame with a solid, metallic thunk, when a voice sliced through the silence. "Douglas? What the hell are you doing?" Douglas jumped, his hand snapping back as if the lock were white-hot. David, the CEO, was standing in the open doorway of the executive suite, a leather laptop bag slung over his shoulder and a look of pure, sharp-edged irritation on his face. David was a man who lived by the second, a man who viewed any deviation from the norm as an inefficiency to be corrected. He strode toward Douglas, his expensive leather loafers clicking with an authority that usually made Douglas pull his cart to the side and lower his head. "It's not 9 o'clock, David said, tapping the face of his Rolex. "I have 3 more files to pull from the server room before I head out. Why are you locking up early? Are you trying to cut out before your shift is over?" Douglas stood his ground, though every instinct he possessed told him to apologize and vanish. He could feel the weight of David's stare, a gaze that saw a lazy employee instead of a guardian. How could he explain the van? The shadows? To a man like David, Douglas was a man of brooms and buckets, not security strategies. Sir, I think it's best we close up now, Douglas stammered, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. David's eyes narrowed, his patience evaporating. I don't pay you to think about the schedule, Douglas. I pay you to follow it. Unlock the door. Now. Douglas looked past David's shoulder toward the far end of the hallway, where the service elevator's floor indicator light began to glow, climbing steadily toward the 4th floor. The invisible man looked at the powerful billionaire, realizing they were standing at a crossroads of life and death, separated only by a layer of glass and a man's pride. He didn't move. He kept his hand on the key, his face set in a mask of stubborn, terrified determination. The silence that followed David's command was broken by the soft, mechanical chime of the elevator. The doors at the end of the long corridor slid open, but no one stepped out immediately. Instead, a heavy silence poured into the hallway. David began to reach for the handle, his face flushed with the indignant heat of a man used to absolute obedience. Douglas, I'm not going to ask you again. Give me the words died in his throat. A figure emerged from the shadows of the elevator alcove, draped in dark, non-reflective gear. The intruder didn't run. He moved with a chilling, predatory confidence, his face hidden behind a tactical mask that turned him into a featureless void. In his hand, he carried a short, heavy crowbar, and at his hip sat a holster that made the reality of the situation shatter David's world like dropped crystal. Behind the first man, 2 more silhouettes appeared, their movements synchronized and professional. David's hand, which had been reaching for the door, suddenly recoiled as if the glass were made of ice. He stumbled back, his laptop bag sliding off his shoulder and hitting the floor with a dull thud. He looked at the intruders, then at the thick, reinforced glass of the finance wing door, and finally at Douglas. The lazy janitor was no longer shaking. Douglas stood with his back against the locked door, his hand still white-knuckled around the key, his body a human shield between the CEO and the wolves. The lead intruder reached the door and gripped the handle, yanking it with a violent, metallic jerk. The deadbolt, the one Douglas had slid into place just seconds before David's arrival, held firm. The masked man growled, a low, guttural sound of frustration, and slammed the crowbar against the glass. The reinforced pane spiderwebbed, a white map of fractures blooming across the surface, but it didn't shatter. David was paralyzed, his breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. He was inches away from a man who intended to kill him, separated only by a barrier he had just tried to dismantle. He looked at Douglas's profile, the weathered skin, the steady gaze, the calm focus of a man who had spent 40 years preparing for a moment he hoped would never come. For the first time in his life, David didn't see a janitor. He saw the only thing standing between him and the end. Through the fractured glass, the intruder's eyes met theirs cold, dark, and filled with the realization that the invisible man had won. The alarm began to wail, a high-pitched scream that tore through the building, but all David could hear was the frantic drumming of his own heart and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man who had saved him. The sirens arrived as a cacophony of blue and red, slicing through the rainy Chicago night and reflecting off the fractured glass of the finance wing. The intruders, realizing the clean entry had turned into a fortress, had vanished back into the shadows of the stairwell long before the first boots hit the lobby floor. Now, the hallway was a sea of tactical vests and shouting officers, but for Douglas and David, the world had shrunk to the few square feet of carpet where they stood. The adrenaline that had sustained Douglas for the last 10 minutes finally ebbed away, leaving his limbs heavy and his knees screaming with a familiar, dull fire. He slowly let go of the key. His hand was cramped into a claw, the brass ridges of the master key imprinted deeply into his palm. He leaned against the wall, his dark blue overalls stained with sweat, and the dust of the night's labor, feeling every bit of his 58 years. He expected the police to shove him aside or for David to be whisked away by a security detail, but the world didn't return to its old axis. David hadn't moved. He was sitting on the floor, his back against a mahogany planter, his sharp suit rumpled and his expensive tie loosened. He was staring at the spider-webbed glass of the door, the barrier that had transformed from an inconvenience into a sanctuary. When a young officer approached David to escort him downstairs, the CEO held up a hand, silencing the man without looking at him. His eyes were fixed on Douglas. "You knew," David said, his voice stripped of its usual corporate polish. It was raw, shaking with the aftershock of a man who had stared into the void and been pulled back at the last second. "You didn't just lock the door. You knew they were coming." Douglas wiped a hand across his forehead, leaning his head back against the cool stone wall. "I saw the van, sir. And the shadows. This building, it talks to you if you stay in it long enough. Tonight, it was telling me someone didn't belong." David stood up slowly, his legs still unsteady. He walked over to Douglas, stopping just outside the older man's personal space. For years, they had existed in the same rooms, yet David had never truly seen the person behind the uniform. He had seen a function, a service, a ghost that emptied bins. Now, looking at the steady hands of the man who had stood his ground against a crowbar and a curse, David felt a profound sense of shame. The hierarchy that had defined their lives, the penthouse office versus the basement locker room, had dissolved in the span of a single metallic click. "I called you lazy," David whispered, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. "I told you that I paid you to follow the schedule, not to think." He reached out, hesitating for a second before placing a firm, trembling hand on Douglas's shoulder. It wasn't the patronizing pat of a boss, it was the touch of a man acknowledging his savior. "I was wrong, Douglas. I've been blind to a lot of things in this building. Starting with you." The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the executive boardroom, but the light felt clinical rather than warm. Douglas sat at the foot of the massive table, his dark blue work shirt buttoned to the neck, feeling painfully out of place amidst the circle of men in charcoal suits. These were the experts, the heads of Global Heights Security and the insurance adjusters, and they were looking for a scapegoat. Across from them, David sat at the head of the table, silent, his face a mask of exhaustion as he watched the lead security consultant, a man named Miller, tap a pen against a thick folder of protocols. "Mr. Mitchell," Miller began, his voice dripping with the practiced condescension of someone who viewed security as a series of spreadsheets. "While the outcome was fortunate, we have a serious problem with the sequence of events. You bypassed the central alarm, ignored the radio check-in, and, most importantly, you violated the timed access protocol by locking a tier, one asset 10 minutes before the scheduled deadline. If the CEO had been trapped on the other side of that door because of your hunch, we'd be discussing a kidnapping today." Douglas felt the familiar weight of his own silence pressing down on him. He looked at his hands, calloused and stained with the faint residue of industrial cleaner, and, for a moment, he felt like the invisible man again. He began to offer an apology, the words of a man used to taking the blame just to keep the peace. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." "He didn't mean to do anything other than save my life," David interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. He stood up, leaning forward until his shadow fell across Miller's reports. The boardroom went deathly quiet. "You're talking about protocols and schedules. You're talking about the correct way to be robbed." Douglas didn't look at a clock. He looked at the building. He saw a threat your million-dollar cameras missed because he cares about this tower more than any of you. Miller shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Sir, we have to maintain the integrity of the system. If every janitor starts making his own rules, then maybe the building would be safer," David snapped. He walked the length of the table, stopping beside Douglas. He didn't sit. He stood by him, an unmistakable signal of alignment. Douglas didn't breach the system. He was the system when everything else failed. I'm not here to listen to a lecture on his insubordination. I'm here to find out why a man with a mop saw an invasion coming while you were all staring at your monitors. He looked down at Douglas, and for the first time, the invisible man felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in 40 years. He felt seen. David wasn't just defending a worker, he was defending a peer. The blue-collar janitor and the white-collar CEO were no longer on opposite ends of a ledger. They were two men who had survived a storm together, and David was making it clear that from this day forward, Douglas's instincts were the new protocol. A week after the sirens had faded, David found himself pulling up to a modest, red-brick duplex on the outskirts of the city. It was a world away from the glass and steel heights of the Global Heights Tower. He carried a small gift, a rare bottle of scotch, but as he stepped onto the porch, his intention of a simple thank you felt suddenly inadequate. Douglas opened the door, dressed in a faded flannel shirt, looking smaller without the dark blue uniform, yet more at ease. The apartment was small, but meticulously kept, smelling of old paper and cedarwood. As Douglas went to the kitchen to find glasses, David's eyes wandered to a large drafting table tucked into the corner of the living room, bathed in the glow of a dedicated lamp. It was covered in translucent vellum sheets and intricate, hand-drawn blueprints. Intrigued, David stepped closer, expecting to see hobbyist sketches or perhaps a map of the tower's plumbing. What he saw instead took his breath away. The sheets were detailed security overlays of the Global Heights Tower, but they weren't the ones David recognized. Douglas had mapped the ghost paths, the blind spots of every camera, the acoustic vibrations of the air ducts, and the structural vulnerabilities created by the building's unique cantilever design. Beside the drawings were notebooks filled with decades of observations, how heat sensors failed during heavy rain, how the magnetic locks on the service elevators had a 2-second delay during power cycles, and a series of proposed passive deterrents that were more brilliant than anything the high-priced consultants had ever pitched. "You've been redesigning the building's soul," David whispered as Douglas returned with 2 glasses. Douglas looked at the table, a shy, almost guilty smile touching his lips. "I wanted to be a security architect. Back in the day," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a dream deferred by the necessity of a steady paycheck. "Life just had other plans. I spent 40 years cleaning the floors, but I couldn't help but look at the walls and see how they could be stronger. I suppose I've been building my own version of the tower in my head for a long time." David ran a finger over a particularly complex diagram of the loading dock, the very area where the van had been parked. He realized then that Douglas wasn't just a janitor with a good gut. He was a master of a craft he had never been allowed to practice. The blueprints weren't just drawings. They were the evidence of a brilliant mind that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally look at the man instead of the uniform. David didn't drink the scotch. He set the glass down on the edge of the drafting table, his eyes never leaving the intricate lines of Douglas's life's work. The silence in the small apartment stretched out, no longer the awkward silence of a boss and an employee, but the heavy, expectant quiet of a moment where a life is about to pivot. David looked at Douglas, the man who had seen the flaws in the glass and the shadows in the rain, and saw more than a survivor. He saw a partner. "Douglas," David began, his voice steady with a new kind of conviction. "The men I pay millions to secure my assets have degrees from Ivy League schools and fancy offices. But they don't know the sound of a failing magnetic lock, and they don't understand the ghost paths of a building they only visit for quarterly meetings. You've spent 40 years doing their job better than they have, all while pushing them up." Douglas looked down at his hands, the same hands that had turned the key that saved David's life. "I was just doing what I felt was right for the building, sir." "It's more than that," David countered, stepping closer. "It's expertise. It's genius. And it's been ignored for too long." He gestured to the vellum sheets. "I want to take these drawings. I want to take your notebooks and your 40 years of observation, and I want to put a name on the door." not global heights. Mitchell Security Solutions. Douglas froze, a half-smile of disbelief flickering on his face. Sir, I'm a janitor. I'm 2 years from a pension. I don't know the first thing about starting a firm. You know the only thing that matters, how to keep people safe, David said. I'll handle the incorporation, the office space, and the legalities. I'll be your first client. I want you to consult on the security overhaul of the entire Global Heights portfolio. No more dark blue overalls, Douglas. No more being invisible. I'm investing in you because you invested 40 years in a building that didn't even know your last name. Tears pricked at the corners of Douglas's eyes, a lifetime of being overlooked suddenly being washed away by a single, monumental gesture of recognition. He looked at the blueprints, the dreams he had sketched in the middle of the night, and realized they were no longer just paper. They were a map to a future he thought had passed him by. David held out his hand, not as a superior, but as a man offering a bridge. Douglas took it, his grip firm and calloused, sealing a pact that would turn the invisible man into the most essential man in the city. Exactly 1 year to the day since the click of fate, a sleek black car pulled up to the main entrance of the Global Heights Tower. The morning sun blazed off the glass exterior, turning the monolith into a pillar of light. Douglas stepped out, but the heavy, dark blue overalls were gone. In their place was a charcoal gray suit that fit him with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged. He didn't carry a mop or a bucket. He carried a slim leather briefcase and a digital tablet that held the pulse of the building's new, impenetrable security grid. As he walked through the lobby, the loose floor tiles no longer clicked. They had been reinforced according to his specifications. The acoustic sensors he had designed were tucked invisibly into the architectural molding, and the ghost paths he had once mapped on vellum were now monitored by a system that understood the building's heartbeat as well as he did. The staff at the front desk, who once looked through him as if he were made of air, stood a little straighter as he approached. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," they said with genuine warmth. Douglas offered a polite nod, a small smile playing on his lips. He wasn't invisible anymore. He took the executive elevator to the penthouse, the ride silent and smooth. When the doors opened, David was waiting, standing in the same corridor where they had once stared down a predator through a sheet of cracked glass. The old, fractured door had been replaced by a state-of-the-art ballistic barrier, but David had insisted on one small, sentimental touch. The original brass lock cylinder had been encased in a small acrylic display on the wall beside the entrance. "The Mitchell system is fully online," David said, reaching out to shake Douglas's hand. "The board is calling it the most sophisticated security overhaul in corporate history." "It's just about listening to the building, David," Douglas replied, his voice humble but steady. They stood together for a moment, looking out through the massive windows at the city sprawling below. Douglas thought about the thousands of people moving through the streets, the waitresses, the janitors, the invisible sentries who saw the world's secrets while no one saw them. He realized then that his story wasn't just about a robbery or a promotion. It was about the ripple effect of a single moment of courage. One choice had saved David's life, but David's recognition had saved Douglas's soul. As they turned to walk toward the boardroom together, Douglas felt the weight of the master key in his pocket, not the heavy brass one of a servant, but the key to a legacy he had finally been allowed to build. The world might see a person as broken or silent today, but as Douglas knew, one turn of the lock can change everything. We all walk past people like Douglas every single day. We see the uniform, the task, the service, but so rarely do we see the human being behind it. This story is a powerful reminder that expertise doesn't always come with a title, and heroics don't always wear a cape. Sometimes, the most important person in the room is the one the world has taught us to ignore. Douglas spent 40 years in the shadows, not because he lacked brilliance, but because no one bothered to look. The lesson here is simple yet profound. One choice can change the trajectory of multiple lives. For Douglas, it was the choice to trust his instinct and act, even when it meant breaking the rules. For David, it was the choice to look past his own ego and recognize the man who had saved him. We often think of saving a life as a physical act, but David saved Douglas's life just as surely as Douglas saved his, by giving him back his visibility, his purpose, and his dream. You have that power too. You have the power to be a Douglas, to act with courage in small, crucial moments when the world is looking the other way. And you have the power to be a David, to acknowledge the invisible people in your own life and realize that their worth isn't defined by the clothes they wear or the jobs they perform. Every single day, you have the chance to be the person who turns the key. You never know how far those ripples will reach. You never know whose life you might change simply by noticing them. So be observant. Be grateful. And above all, be the person who values character over status. Because the world doesn't just need more CEOs, it needs more people like Douglas, ordinary people who make extraordinary choices when it matters most. The world needs you to see the signal.